Okay, welcome. Thanks everyone so much for coming. I'm a part of SLASC. I'm the programming director. SLASC is the Special Libraries Student Association, and we support information professionals working in non-traditional environments, which include medical libraries, law libraries, and museums and visual resource libraries. And our group is for students who are already employed or are interested in employment in these libraries and information centers. And we are co-hosting the event. And so I will pass it over to Rena.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rena. I'm the vice chair. I wonder if we say SAASC because I heard you say SLASC and I'm not sure if that's the appropriate lingo, but it's the Society of American Archivists student chapter at SJSU. Our goal is to promote archival interests at the iSchool and to provide a platform to discuss archival issues and the different types of roles in the archival profession. We're excited to collaborate with SLASC on tonight's speaker event. And welcome, Hannah. It's so good to have you here. And this topic is really fascinating. So I appreciate you creating space to discuss this with us, especially in our current climate. So thank you.
Of course. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to meet you. My name's Hannah Whelan. My pronouns are she, her. Should I give like an introduction or what's useful right now?
I would love to go ahead and give you a little introduction if you're okay with that. Um, Hannah, is it Whelan or Whelan? Okay. Hannah Whelan is the Associate Director of the Texas After Violence Project, a community-based archive and documentary project that cultivates deeper understandings of the impacts of state violence on individuals, families, and communities. In addition to her work at TAVP, she also provides consulting services for various projects contending with sensitive text-based and oral records obtained through litigation against the US government or through Freedom of Information Act requests. So again, thank you and welcome.
Yeah,
All right.
and
Oh, go
thank
ahead.
you. Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. I'm very excited to talk today. And I think when we connected, you were the archives director. So maybe we could just open with kind of like what that role was, kind of like the role in the org, and maybe just more context about the org in general.
Of course, yeah. So Texas After Violence Project has been around for 18, well, we're about to have our 18th birthday. And it was founded primarily by lawyers who worked on death penalty cases in Texas and beyond. And the reason they founded it was mostly because they understood that storytelling plays a really active role in court cases, especially death penalty cases, and that there's a lot of impacted people, victims' family members, the defendant's family members who are kind of pulled into these storytelling and narrative roles, whether through giving testimony or being interviewed. And they were interested in creating a storytelling archive with impacted people that can kind of better illustrate the impacts of the death penalty on everyone involved and create more nuanced discussion around it. So because it was mostly lawyers, it was very like formal. The oral history format and style was very formal, and it operated this way for a few years. Lawyers would drive all around Texas and neighboring states, go to people's houses, conduct these interviews about cases, and deposit them physically in this office in Austin, Texas. And yeah, it's been around since. And then I came on while I was still in library school at UCLA. I had attended many of the talks from TAVP as they had moved kind of outside of like lawyer-based oral history interviews into more community-based trauma-informed archive and oral history methods. And so I was watching their presentations, showing up all the time, asking a lot of questions. And finally, the executive director was like, "Who are you? Why are you always here? Do you want to come talk to us in a meeting?" And I started my internship that way, essentially through mild stalking, not really, just attending all the meetings. So during my internship, I helped work with a massive collection of physical records, photographs, legal documents, documenting the criminal legal system in Texas from 1920 to 1980, really sensitive case documents. Eventually became a staff member and then became the documentation archives director, working to build out our physical collections, to redesign our digital archive, which is hosted in Mukuru, and is called the After Violence Archive, and to kind of expand the intersection between our public programming and our archives. So making sure that more folks get to feel invited into the archives, feel like they can participate in not only telling their story, but describing and owning their story afterwards, and also come in as archivists and oral historians themselves through peer interview and peer archive programs, which I worked closely with our public programs director, Murphy Carter, on. Yeah, and so from that role, just kind of continued my work, and then TAVP tripled in size since I first came on. And so it became clear that we needed to create some new roles to look at all the public programs, look at all the archival initiatives, and make sure they were speaking to one another and they were constantly in community with impacted folks, with folks who are interested in our work. So we created the associate director role, which I've now been in for not that long. But still an archivist, still very passionate about the archives, have no long-term intention of nonprofit leadership, but I'm absolutely honored to be able to continue TAVP's important archive and documentary work from this kind of new perspective.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And before we move forward, I'm kind of curious what measures you took in that project to honor privacy and still be able to share the stories that people were offering in depth. But were there parameters, or did you create those parameters? Because I know that digitizing and archival work right now, I mean, it's still, we're at this jumping off space, right? This foundation building space. So a lot of the content hasn't been protected. So I'm curious how you went about that.
Yeah, so TAVP has a lot of kind of best practices and procedures around privacy and safety in general. I'll speak from the perspective of the collection I mentioned that I first started with during my internship of probably our most sensitive documents. We did not want to digitize these documents for a couple reasons. One, because many of the stories within them just weren't ours to tell. We felt that they were important stories because they very much illustrated how the state of Texas was using race and gender and socioeconomic status to dehumanize people and to say that they deserved capital punishment, which we knew wasn't true, especially in 1920s Texas. And so illustrating the impact of that language and of the state's violence is extremely important to us, but not amplifying it by just digitizing it and reproducing it is of equal importance. So what we ultimately decided to do with that collection was to digitize it and not publicize it. So we did digitize the materials, we just haven't ever made them public. And we did research to find descendants of people in the records or people themselves who might still be alive in the records who are publicly engaging with the stories. So not just like searching them out and contacting them, but people who are on podcasts talking about their experience, people who were talking to the media about their experience, who had their own YouTube channels. And we started by contacting them and saying, we have these records, they could serve very important purposes for posthumous exoneration, for understanding more about what happened in your loved one's case that the state of Texas didn't share. Would you want to access them? And if so, how would you want to access them? And we worked with people to get records back to them in those instances. Also being receptive and offering options for if people wanted records destroyed or didn't want to engage. And also being really receptive to family members potentially wanting to advise and give their expertise on what publication in the future should or shouldn't look like for these records. From that outreach, we ended up building a relationship with one of the descendants in the records who wanted to do oral history work around his father, who had been executed and whose records we held. He wanted to do an oral history interview. We did, and afterwards he kept saying, like, I want this story to go further. I want this story to go further. And we ended up making a documentary with him, where he was able to place a headstone for his father and have a ceremony with his family. And he dictated what that documentary looked like. Him and his family members were the only ones who received any funding from that documentary. And so it was an example of taking records that were too sensitive to make public, but still being able to create counter narratives from them, right? And being able to tell stories from them with impacted people. Otherwise, for like our general oral history interviews and stuff, we do what we call a risk assessment with people telling their story, where we first sit down with them and ask if there's anything they don't want to talk about, anything they legally can't talk about, if there's any sensitive forms of supervision like parole or probation that prohibit them from saying certain things. And then when we do oral history interviews, we'll create transcripts, share them with folks to review before making anything public, things like that. And then we're all, we still all like have pretty fundamental understandings of what constitutes legal risk, though we are not lawyers. If something's concerning, we'll of course speak with a lawyer. And then I see a question in the chat.
Yeah, so the question is, have you run into any legal issues from the state or any organization while digitizing or publicizing them?
Yeah, if we had publicized the collection of records I was just talking about, I think there would be real risk with the state potentially wanting to seize them. Because the state of Texas is, very active in control of narratives, and they have their own state libraries and archives where they oftentimes attempt to kind of stow stories away. And many of the narratives in this collection were also present in the Texas State Libraries and Archives. And we know that because we requested them as if we didn't also have the records. And when we received them, there was a lot missing. So that told us everything we needed to know about the fact they weren't trying to make these public. They didn't want everyone to have knowledge. So there would probably be legal risks involved there. Otherwise, we have not had legal risks. With the incoming administration and increasingly right-wing takeovers in Texas universities and across the US, we are trying to build out very nuanced contingency plans in the event that, we are targeted or that there are certain legal issues.
So when you are working with these stories that do, right, there is so much like trauma involved in them, just how does navigating that work like, of like not wanting to like re-trigger someone, or even like kind of like mitigating your own like or just like trauma-informed practices that your org has? Kind of just expand a little about. I'm very curious about, especially with work that is so, I could imagine it would be it would be easy to do this irresponsibly. And so
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk first about kind of trauma-informed approaches for people we work with, and then I'll talk next about trauma-informed approaches for ourselves as practitioners. So one thing, first and foremost, that we try and be very careful about is not approaching anyone who isn't either one, approaching us to tell their story, or two, very publicly saying they are seeking outlets to tell their story. The instance of the person who we made the documentary with, that project, that's a very rare instance of outreach. We actually receive, of us conducting outreach, we mostly receive requests from people that we respond to, and we'll do a couple things before we either work with them to digitize their materials or do oral history work with them. One, we'll understand what their intentions are and what their capacity for telling their story in that moment is. 2, what they're hoping to get from it, which is oftentimes to be heard. 3, what obstacles to telling this story they've faced in the past, because that oftentimes, knowing that is a way to avoid re-traumatizing, to not replicate any of the behaviors they faced in the past. 4, we built out a couple years ago a entire team of licensed therapists at TAVP through a program called Access to Treatment, where if people are facing difficulties after telling their story, or they reach out to us and they're going through something, we can refer them to people that are licensed. And at this point, I think it's 17 states to provide free or low cost therapy about what they're experiencing. And we also are very cognizant of the fact that a lot of people have been traumatized by clinical settings, and by therapy in general, by psychology. They might have distrust for it. There might be cultural barriers to accessing it. So we're able to say, this is part of our organization. We work with these clinicians. We trust them. We can vouch for them after we've built rapport with people. So that's useful too, because I think a big issue with especially oral history, is, and I turn a lot to Era Tanzi's article, No One Owes Their Trauma to Archivists. It's one I've reread so many times. A big issue is people not being ready to contend with how much pain, like I call it a narrative hangover, can come from telling your story, even if it's so well received, even if you're listened to, it's still sometimes so painful. And I hear like narrative power, narrative change all the time, and I believe in those things, but the narrative hangover is so real. So another thing we try and do is also constantly take trainings and understand ourselves about how memory functions and how trauma impacts it, what the different types of memory are, and also how to identify when they might be activated in an oral history. So when we sit down with folks, we make sure that they're in a comfortable space. We make sure they know they can take breaks. We make sure there's tissue, water. We ask if they've eaten, if they need anything, like setting the stage too, physically or digitally, makes a difference. And then care for ourselves. This is one that I think we're always working on. Like, I think it's easier for us to be trauma informed in with the people we work with, and as storytellers and narrators. For ourselves, we take breaks. Like if we don't stack oral history interviews back to back. We don't talk about archiving or oral history like a production, like we take time off. Most of us are involved in like peer networks or affinity groups. One that was really useful for me when I first started this work was called the Trauma Informed Archive Community of Practice. And it's like a global network of archivists talking about these very things, trauma in archives. Doing our reading, I mean, there's so many incredible people writing about their experiences and doing research around vicarious trauma in the archives. I think about Michelle Caswell, Jennifer Douglas, a lot of different, scholars and practitioners and archivists. So breaks, reading, connecting with others, never, ever, ever doing this work alone. And, being responsive to requests from other people who might not have the support of a 20-person nonprofit, but are interested in doing this, and talking with them about what support looks like to them, and being in community generally. I'm also a steering committee member on something called the Community Archives Collaborative. That's a space where we talk about trauma quite a bit and talk about trauma-informed practices quite a bit.
Thank you for sharing all of that incredible information. Just so all attendees know, in addition to this being recorded, we will have a transcription and a list of a lot of these resources that will be piled together throughout this talk. I want to sort of shift gears a little and exhale from that. So thinking about your day-to-day and the types of mediums you're working with, you mentioned photographs and written materials and the oral history. Was there any aspect or archival medium that you were most excited about? And then the next part of that question, for future archivists wanting to pursue this type of work, are there resources or training or platforms that you would suggest navigating and diving into?
Yeah. Oh, I love questions about excitement. Okay, so favorite. I'm always really honored when multiple parties approach us or approach me with correspondence. And they're like, we want to archive this, our handwritten letters or our emails. It's always tricky if one person approaches and they're like, I want to share all these letters. We can't do that, of course, because we need consent from everyone. But when everyone's consenting, I find that to be one of the most like just generous, kind ways that we can interact with people as archivists to make sure that their relationship is documented through a record. Working with people's handwriting is such an honor, even though it's sometimes tricky. And making sure that people can participate in like description and metadata for their own correspondence is really cool. I'll also say I just love working collaboratively with metadata in general. We do a lot of projects with students to describe collections alongside them. We'll like generate word clouds with them and then like match that to our semi-controlled vocabulary. So I'd say any correspondence, any artwork. I love artwork. Any collaborative metadata reparative description projects are probably my favorite. And then as far as resources for people wanting to get into this work, do you mean specifically kind of like work with stories of state violence or just like archival work in general?
I want to just keep it in your realm, in your scope specifically.
Yeah. Well, I will say there's like a very, very, very intense interest in this work right now, both from funders and from practitioners. There's been like massive projects across universities right now about archiving incarceration, archiving the death penalty. I mean, there was just like the giant project at UCLA called Archiving the Age of Mass Incarceration. And so right now there's this giant rush of interest, and there's a lot of people who have been doing it for a while who are trying to like respond to this sudden rush. And so in response to that, myself and a couple others from organizations that do similar work recently, well, not recently, like a year ago, started a group where we meet monthly and we talk about like hurdles in our field, we talk about victories, and we share best practices. So if you are interested in attending and just hearing people who have been in this work for a while talk, let me know. You can reach out to me. It's an informal space, like we don't have any sort of public presence, but that's always an opportunity. Otherwise, I would say to connect with the Community Archives Collaborative. There's quite a bit of writing right now around the field too. I would poke around the university projects that are kind of springing up right now around this and see what you do and don't like. Maybe reach out to people who are involved with those projects who typically have their information publicly available.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I am just curious. I'm not sure how much you would feel comfortable sharing, but just in terms of like being a nonprofit and being like kind of based in a state where it feels a little, at least like in terms of like state funding or like even like federal funding, like just like funding structure wise, like what navigating that looks like of just the different kind of revenue flows for the org.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as funding goes, we are grant funded through primarily the Mellon Foundation. They fund a lot of work in the community archive space right now. community archives, as they define it, you know, so this can be anything from like work like ours to 1,000 other projects, but anything that they see as like not being supported by an institution. So otherwise we rely on funding from like the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, National Endowment for the Humanities. So we're always looking for grants and trying to apply for them, but also balancing that with the fact that we don't want to be beholden to grant cycles and grant deliverables, and that most funders aren't going to fund work that they deem too radical, right? Or like too kind of against the grain. And so what we also do in order to like keep ourselves alive and generate revenue is we do consulting. So like universities will approach us and hire us for their projects, you know, because like they're starting a new collection and they're working with sensitive records and they see some similarities with our work. And we'll use that money that we generate to support our work that we don't want to fund with grants because we don't want to be beholden to grant cycles. So we get to do the stuff that basically we don't want to have to like report back on the work to support community members directly, like put money into mutual aid funds, stuff like that. That's all generated from consulting. Otherwise, I mean, we do, like every nonprofit, do fundraising campaigns, but you know, we're oftentimes not like the people who are interested in our work aren't oftentimes coming to us with like a whole lot of money that they're trying to give away. And so we don't want to be extractive of our individual community members. And so that's like, I'd say a very small portion of our revenue and budget is those fundraising campaigns. But I'm going to be real with you. I mean, to me, this is like the most difficult part of working in a nonprofit is balancing the sustainability of our work and showing up for the people who have trusted us with their stories and trust that our work will continue, with the reality of like having to exist and hustle in this cycle of the nonprofit complex. So it's tough.
Thank you for sharing that. And navigating budgets is definitely tricky. I've done work with an art collaborative, and you just try to make it stretch, especially when it feels sort of grassroots like as far as funding. And in California, it can be really difficult. So I just want to applaud you for doing the work that you're doing and highlighting these stories and sort of pioneering a project like this in a very controversial place, as well as this current climate. And how exciting to see that this project also has this documentary element to it. So I want to hear a little bit more about that. And I would also love to hear if you're going to highlight any of the stories that you found discrepancies on when you did your own research, ordering some of those documents that didn't have accurate or information of that nature. Is that something that you're going to include in the documentary, or how are you going to navigate that end of it?
Yeah, so we have finished filming and almost finished editing the documentary, and we ultimately decided not to include anything about the archive or the documents because for a couple of reasons. One, we didn't want to bring attention to the fact that we had these documents. Two, because for the person telling the story who was the descendant of the person who was executed by the state of Texas, the documents played such a small role in his story. He's like, okay, I have more information, but I'm interested in like the documentary part of your work. Like, let's do this. So because it wasn't a huge focus for him, we didn't include them. What I am very interested in doing is a project in the future, once we navigate some more of the legal hurdles around our possession of these documents, where we can compare. But what we've decided to do, even if we can't compare what the state holds versus what they'll give us versus what we have, we want to publish all of our information requests to them so that people can see what it takes to get information out of the Texas State Libraries and Archives Commission. And also, if you're getting the information mailed to you, how much it costs. because, you know, of course, archival labor should be compensated, and archivists at the state level are going through and redacting things and filing through things, but it's also a massive hurdle to people getting the information that the state is then passing that on to information seekers. So that's something we're really interested in highlighting as well.
Thank you. That's really exciting. And is this going to be, so you said you're in the editing phase and wrapping all of that up. Um, how is this going to be distributed and where can people find it once it is?
Yeah. So we're going to be sharing it through our website, and then we're also going to be hosting 3 types of screenings. So public screenings primarily in Northern Texas, because that's where all the family members and community members related to the story are. So those are going to be at community spaces there. We're going to be hosting screenings at like universities and law clinics, specifically to try and engage interest from folks who can do more research into stories like this, who can kind of push back on some of these narratives from legal perspectives. And then we're also going to be doing small film festival submission screenings. With all 3 of these elements, I'm hoping TAVP can also host like our own kind of screenings virtually, so that folks can like feel invited to participate that aren't just in Texas.
There is a question in the chat of how much are lawyers still part of the archive process now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our founder, who is a lawyer, is still, you know, on our board. We work with a lot of like lawyer activists in collaborative roles, but it's not like a legal project. We don't do any sort of like work into clemency or appeals. We do get outreach like that a lot, and we always have to be very clear that like we are not a legal organization. We are a storytelling project with a, you know, clinician therapy component, but not a legal component. So we can always like offer documents to people who might be seeking them out for their own legal purposes, and we'll, you know, share them, of course, but we have to be very careful about that.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
wondering about, so you said that this documentary project was like kind of a special case, but just in terms of like what the like other oral history collection like workflow, what that kind of looks like, and kind of like from beginning to like what those end up being, if not documentaries.
Yeah. So people will typically reach out to us and say, either I think I have a story that I want to be archived through an interview. Most people know us as like, I want to do an interview project with you, or I have these documents. And they're typically referred to us because they've experienced some sort of state violence. So they've experienced police brutality, or they've experienced long-term solitary confinement, or they're the loved ones of someone who's been executed and they want to tell their story. So when they reach out to us, we will always suggest to meet with them, whether in person or over Zoom, to have like what we call the pre-interview conversations, to learn more about their story, to learn kind of like I mentioned earlier, what they're hoping to tell, or what they're hoping the outcome of telling the story will be, how we can assist them, and importantly, if there's anything they don't want to talk about. From there, we will go ahead and schedule an interview with them, unless there's something shared in that first conversation, or like there's a concern about how consent's operating, or anything like that. Or if there's, I mean, there's been, you know, very rare, but like instances where in those conversations, like hate speech emerges, and we have to understand that like that's just not something we're willing to platform through the archive. So having those conversations, or something that we see as like not mission aligned speech. So once we schedule the interview, we will meet in person or over Zoom. Historically, it was in person, and include both like a video and audio component to the interview. And prior to that happening, we'll also have shared an outline of some potential questions that we think would be useful to ask in the interview. And we ask them if they'd like anything removed or added. Most people who come to us are just like, just ask questions. Like they don't want to participate in drafting them, but some people do. So we go ahead and we do the interview. We never go above 90 minutes because that's when things can get like really raw for everyone involved in the process, whether operating the camera, doing the interview, or telling their story. After 90 minutes, the toll can really set in. So we will stop at 90 minutes and either conclude or, schedule a part 2, part 3. From there, we will take the audio, we'll run it through a transcription service that gives us an auto-generated transcript that we then correct. In that process, we keep people's voice, their speech patterns and their ways of speaking. So we're not editing out filler words, we're not doing anything like that. And then we share it back with them, unless on their consent form, they indicated they don't want to see something before it's made public. In the process of correcting the auto-generated transcript for any like misspellings and formatting, we're also doing the risk assessment. So we're flagging anything where they mention someone's personal details that aren't their own. They mention something that could reasonably result in them facing some sort of penalty. Anything like that we'll flag. But regardless, we'll share the transcript back with them, make sure they're cool with it, also share the audio or video if they want it. And then from there, we'll go ahead and make it public for folks who want to participate in the archiving, like post-interview archiving aspects. We will create metadata and a description with them. We'll sit mostly over Zoom and do that and like walk through our semi-controlled vocabulary and show them like our faceted keyword searching. And it's really cool how many folks, I think definitely do have an interest in that, even if they don't have the capacity to sit down and like participate in it. From there, things go into Mukadu. They become hosted on our After Violence archive, and we make sure we're responsive to the person who told their story. If they ever reach out again, they retain ownership of the story, and they also retain the right to request that it be taken down at any point. But we make sure they know that we can always take things down, but once they're on the internet, there could be proliferations of them that we can't control. So we're also real about like how ownership and rights can exist in this digital context.
Thank you for going through that whole process. It's really interesting, and I really like how you were sharing the collaborative nature of metadata work. That is not something that I had really thought about in working on projects like yours. So yeah, I think that that's really interesting. And I want to scale back a little. A lot of us are students here. A lot of us are in the in librarianship programs, or hopefully, aspiring archivists ourselves. From your academic standpoint, or academic coursework history, are there any classes or content that you would suggest students take in preparation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say, when I was leaving my program, I felt under-equipped with technical skills, but that wasn't as big of an issue as I thought it would be, because so many of those skills are learned on the job or learned through continuing education or training, because they're also rapidly changing like what the requirements are, what the systems are. The classes that I am so grateful that I took and that I've carried with me most, no matter whether it's this job or the one I had before, are classes around kind of memory, classes around oral history, classes around archives and communities, classes that really, I think, helped me build strong critical analysis frameworks and kind of strong like framings to engage with the things I care about or push back on the things that I don't feel are right sometimes in projects. So I would say those were the most useful for sure.
Thank you for that. I'm in a cultural competency class right now that I feel I fully align with, and the information I believe will translate just even in daily life and in my interactions with others. So I get personally excited when I have courses that can offer that, right? So in this type of work, you're working with diverse populations and people from all walks of life, and whether regardless of which aspect of librarianship you go into. So I really liked how you framed that too, that it not only worked with the position you have now, but in the previous one as well. So thank you for touching on that. And
And before I read this question in the chat, just want to say, like, if anyone wants to like raise their hand or just come off of mute, like feel free also to ask questions or continue to just throw things into the chat. We're kind of coming up towards like the tail end of our time together. But in the chat, are there any cultural competencies that are especially important for students looking to get into trauma-informed archiving?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I would say in my field, it's really important for people to understand why we are doing this work before they tell us their story. And sometimes that really means like sharing the root of it. So like I will sit with people and tell them when I started doing this work, why. I'll share with them that I've had a father incarcerated for 2 decades and how we story tell across incarceration. And that one builds trust. So that's like a trust building kind of competency. And then as far as cultural competencies, a big thing is understanding how different cultures have navigated storytelling. Like when we're saying oral history, understanding that that's just a way of oftentimes rebranding or renaming oral traditions that have existed long before they were called oral history, and being really cognizant of that when describing oral history, hearing what kind of hurdles or walls have existed for people in telling their story, hearing if there were people in their lives telling them not to, like being very receptive to people saying, this is how I have told stories, this is how my family told stories, and this is how we don't tell stories. And embedding that in your process of working with them, whether in an interview or whether with photographs. Also, being really, really open to people wanting to tell you much more than you initially thought. Like when you're working with people's photos, artwork, and stuff, I think especially those mediums, they bring up so much for people. And it's oftentimes much more than an oral history. It's a family tree discussion. It's all of these things. And so I think just being really receptive is a huge one. I also think understanding, like in the communities we work with, sometimes where lack of trust comes from, sometimes issues with working with institutions for people who are coming out of prisons and jails, all of the hurdles they're facing with reentry and why telling their story might not seem like a priority, working with patients to understand those, and also making sure that there's people who are most impacted. So like people in our case who have faced state violence, making sure they're working in our organization, like that's huge too. It's not just making it an organization of people who are well-intentioned and who love archiving, but making it one that's built from the community too.
I really appreciate that. Being mindful of representation. I think that's a really key aspect. Okay, let me see. I feel okay. So another question from the chat. Hannah, I'm curious if you had any legal training before getting into this work, and I hope I didn't miss you mentioning this earlier.
No, great question. Yeah, I was working for a kind of like rights-based legal firm before I got into my career before archives, so 2 careers before this. And that was kind of my introduction. Then I became very involved in appeal work through my advocacy for my own father, and then through my experience through that and getting to work with someone who was exonerated through the Innocence Project after 33 years of wrongful incarceration, working with him post-release on like his documents, his case, his storytelling. All of those required a lot of self-taught legal expertise. But I will say I'm very, very, very cautious, as I mentioned earlier, of never positioning myself as someone who is a paralegal, someone who is a law student, someone who is a lawyer. My legal experience is minimal, so I always defer to actual lawyers. But do I know where to seek them out? Yes. Do I know how to like identify what I shouldn't be reading or what's too sensitive for us as archivists? Yes. And I think that's something that's absolutely a competency that if you're working in these spaces, you're expected to start building out. Is like not being a lawyer, but knowing when you need one.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then the response to your response was very smart. Exclamation point, thank you. So, okay. Does anyone else have any questions from the group? Okay, then I'm gonna go jump in with one of my own. Hannah, thank you for sharing your family history with us too, and trusting us with that. And how, aside from being able to connect with the individuals that you're working with, did your personal experience, how did it, are there other ways that it translated or other ways that you found it useful to ignite that passion for this project? Is that what kind of drew you to it, or was it just all happenstance? If you're
Yeah.
comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had been doing storytelling with people who were incarcerated, people who were victims of crime and loss, and family members on all sides before I was an archivist. And I knew that I needed stronger frameworks to do my work. Like I knew it was too sensitive. I knew I needed stronger frameworks. I don't think you always have to get those through an MLIS program, but in my case, I did. And when I was in the program, I was definitely drawn to Texas After Violence Project because I saw like a deep parallel in what they were doing and what I wanted to learn. Like I wanted to learn to be more trauma informed in interviewing, even though I felt like I kind of inherently might be able to activate some of those skills because I know who I am as a person. I still wanted to learn. I wanted to understand that what I didn't know. Like I always have so much more to learn. So yeah, I started seeing just a lot of things with the project that were exactly what I was seeking out. And otherwise, how like my personal life or history might kind of intersect with my work is like I genuinely love people and I genuinely believe that a better world free from violence and the need for punishment is possible. And I think that through better engagement and better storytelling that we can like inch towards that. And so it is in this like faith in something different and in different systems that I engage in this work. A lot of people are like, interesting that you chose archives as your route, like be a lawyer, do all these things. But I did choose archives because loving people and loving stories and having faith, like all these things are connected. And I never saw archives as like just silently and individually processing paperwork. Like that's never how I saw them. Yeah.
I value that these types of projects in archival work are unsilencing people who are overlooked, right? I mean, these are individuals in the community who often get overlooked, and their stories need to be told. And I really value how you were talking about learning and educating ourselves, right? So in sharing these stories and listening, it really does help us tap into our empathy and just understanding the human condition that we're all a part of, right? And I liked your outlook on optimism, and I think that that's a really important platform to have right now, right? It's we don't need to have a defeatist attitude. We can continue to take these steps in our work and in our daily life to um, in the pursuit of positive change, right? And in these micro shifts that can, have an effect on the bigger picture. So yeah, thank you for sharing those insights. Aiko, did you have any other questions you want to bring to Hannah while we have her here?
I guess kind of just going off of that same vein, what what does like cultivating joy like look like for you, especially when I don't with the whole nonprofit kind of jargon of also this is like a job and also like wanting to like fight for another world, but then it's like those things I feel like it's something that I really struggle with of like kind of like what I want to fight for and kind of like how I'm getting paid and balancing that, and then also just that doesn't end up with just kind of me like in a spiral. So would love to hear what um things that you do that help be a little less spirally.
It's so real. I mean, there are days where making this a job, one, it's really hard, and two, I feel guilty. I'm like, I miss when I just did this outside of any pay being involved, right? Like, because that felt less complicated. And yeah, having to like make the work survive through all these funding cycles and all of it, like it gets to be a lot, but joy is genuinely like one of the most impactful moments of my life was going to North Texas and being in these small, beautiful communities, talking with folks about stories and also talking with them about how memory operates in small towns and stories that have been silenced, and like hearing them talk about the perseverance of memory. Like that's where joy is built. At the end of the documentary filming process, the main person who the documentary was about was like, okay, now I'm gonna interview all of you guys, and like flipped the camera on us. That was joy, like having the tables turned as someone who's always doing the documenting, creating informal spaces for people who do work like this and who sometimes spiral to sit with one another creates joy. Like we make fun of it at TAVP, but like I'll host like little spaces on Zoom and play records, and we'll all like write. It really is treating joy constantly as something that if you don't make sure it exists every day will be fleeting. We also are real when we just can't show up as ourselves and we don't want to be judged for it. The past couple of weeks, a lot of us were like forgetting things. We're like not able to show up. We're struggling. And asking for non-judgment, like that creates joy. I think hosting events when we're able to share aspects of the archive, seeing like people who told their story in an oral history interview show up to these events with kids, watching like their little kids run around and not care about their interview, like things like that. Like these all build joy, because even if you're not doing work like this, archiving is so emotional. Like it's so emotional. So making sure you do it with others, and yeah, seek out peer networks. So I mentioned like the ones that I'm part of, like the Community Archives Collaborative. that's been huge. But there are so many like regional networks, like smaller groups, like y'all have created one, and like making sure to continue and be consistent in the way you show up in those support and education networks, I think is crucial.
Thank you. So we have only a couple minutes left. So I did want to give one last call for any questions in the chat. And also to reiterate that a lot of these resources, in addition to this recording, are going to be accessible and available to the attendees and beyond. So if you missed something, no need to worry. And Hannah, I just genuinely appreciate you and your time and how open you were and candid with your experiences. I know I can speak for everyone and just how much we appreciated this talk and yeah, just the different insights that you brought to the table too, as far as what archiving work can look like and the challenges and broader scope, and that it can make a difference. And yeah, that really meant something to me personally too. So thank you.
And I just want to echo the gratitude. Just thank you, Hannah, so much for spending the time to talk to us. I know I have a lot that I'm going to think about, and this feels really exciting and inspiring. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Also, good luck, everyone, finishing the rest of the semester. I hope that y'all have wonderful nights. And yes, Hannah's website is in the chat. We will also send that out in the email.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Hannah. Before I log off, what was the name of that book you were saying that you had read? You had mentioned an article or a book that you had been revisiting.
Oh, it's an article. Let me drop it in the chat. Well, it's like a blog post.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of
I'm gonna
course.
read it tonight.
I mean, yeah, it was recommended to me when I was in grad school, and I like still share it with people at work all the time and reread it. It's wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you, Aiko, for bringing me on to co-host with you and collaborate with you. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and stay safe and good luck with the rest of the semester, and good luck with finalizing your project, Hannah. I'm super excited to see the documentary when it comes out and support. So
Of course, everyone feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope I see y'all killing it in the field someday. Or you probably already are, but I hope I see you again. Bye.
bye. Thank you.